Hello everyone, welcome to this session on organisational change. Within this video we're going to be talking about the types of change that exist and that organisations might be experiencing and trying to make today. Various approaches to change management that currently exist in relation to theory and practice, how useful they are and when they're useful. We'll also be talking about the difficulties of making change and how we might approach it. So thinking about what type of issue or problem we're looking at, what we'd be trying to improve, and therefore what might be a better type of approach, a better way of leading change. And in relation to that, what the actual role of leaders and managers might be. The two American academics, Beer and Nuria, in their 2000 article Breaking the Code of Change, talked about different types of rationale for organisational change, and they differentiated between what they call a theory E approach and a theory O approach. And a theory E approach might be said to relate to the economy and economic factors being the driving force, whereas a more theory O type approach is based on developing the organisation. So a theory O approach is more linked to the HRM speciality of organisational development. A theory E approach is very much related to kind of competition, the profit motive being the primary motive for everything that's done within the organisation. Now, of course, all private sector organisations, companies need to make a profit, and most big companies are keen to be sustainable and to develop their organisation in a way that is attractive to employees and makes it fit for the future. So it's not that any company or organisation will fit specifically into a theory E or a theory O. We might see elements of both, but we might also be able to think of examples of companies that do seem to be perhaps primarily driven by a profit motive, and they'll often take a very hard top-down approach to change. So they'll have quite structured programs, they might bring in consultants, so it's quite a kind of, related to kind of planetary types of Mars, the kind of hero, focusing on very much kind of control mechanisms to do that. Whereas the theory O approach, which is more related to organisational development, takes that type of approach. It's much more about participation, consultation, letting ideas emerge, maybe starting small, much more nurturing and considering the organisation as an integrated living system. Now, if we go back to Beckard's work in the 1960s, in terms of what making change is really all about, Beckard suggests that there's a kind of process of organisations, set their goals, define where they want to be in the future, what sort of organisational conditions are desired, what they're hoping to achieve. And then it's really a bit of a gap analysis, so diagnosing where we are in relation to those goals and what we need to do to actually kind of fill that gap to meet our future goals and achieve our objectives. Now, diagnosis also comes very much into an organisational development type approach. So OD practitioners will spend quite a lot of time focusing on that diagnosis stage, and they do so much more, as I've said, in relation to working with other stakeholders in a more participative, consultative type of way, to try and overcome perhaps some of the issues that have existed with organisational change, where they've been very top-down and leader-manager led, and perhaps failed to really diagnose what's absolutely going on in the marketplace or on the front line, and really identify all the issues. Beckard talks about defining the transition state activities that are required, and obviously with planned change, not all change today is planned, but where change is a planned type of approach to change, then yes, we would expect that obviously that planning to go into it before the change is actually launched. So we'd expect some consideration of what type of activities we're going to need to do, who we're going to need to involve, and so on, as part of that developing strategies and action plans. Later on, Burns has talked about, change management is really deciding what to change, who it is that needs to change, when to change, and then how we're going to do it. And I'd add to that it's important to spend some time considering, why are we thinking about change? What is it we're really trying to achieve? What will look different? What will have improved after we've made this change? To really kind of think about the problems that underlie. So moving on to think about these underlying problems or issues, most organisations are trying to solve some kind of problem or some kind of issue, make some improvement, or they're anticipating perhaps issues that they will face if they don't make change, ahead of time. And Keith Grint, a UK-based academic, developed work from Rittel and Webber and talked about these different types of problems as being what he called tame problems, critical problems, or more wicked problems. And different approaches are therefore needed. And he suggested that leaders and managers sometimes fail to resolve tame problems, which are not easy problems to solve, but they're problems which have been faced by organisations before and which we have some tried and tested solutions for. But sometimes those problems are not addressed and they become much more critical, they become crises. Wicked problems often relate much more to systemic issues, real big picture kind of problems related to perhaps health and social care, the environment, those sort of issues, quite social oriented issues, which people have not actually found solutions for. So experts have not managed to kind of find some way of solving those. And they're problems that tend to morph, change as we start to take action, as we start to try and address them. There's a video around kind of more tame and wicked problems, which I'll direct you to at the end of this session. For now, we'll think a little bit more about Ron Heifetz, where Ron Heifetz is an American leadership scholar who's done a lot of work in relation to public sector leadership as well. And he talks about technical and adaptive problems. And technical problems or more routine problems we might equate with what Green calls tame problems, and adaptive problems more similar to wicked type problems. And I've suggested at the bottom of this slide here that you pause this video and really search for just under a 10-minute video by Ron Heifetz on the nature of adaptive leadership. And there he talks in a bit more detail about leadership and talks about, how that needs to differ between technical and adaptive type problems. So hopefully you've had a chance to look at the short video by Ron Heifetz, where he's talking about these different types of problems, and he discusses what leaders need to uncover when they're dealing with situations, where they've tended to go wrong in the past when dealing with adaptive problems, and what the role of leaders is, which is very different really from leading from the front or driving things through in the same way as it might be with other types of change program related to more technical type problems. And Ron Heifetz talks about diagnosing, spending a lot of time diagnosing the problem through lots of stakeholder consultation and participation, and getting really wide perspectives. So talking to people that perhaps are not often included in a situation. So it might be, if we're thinking about perhaps current situation of the time of recording with the COVID pandemic, if we're thinking about the university situation, perhaps the group of people that we don't talk to very often would be the cleaners, and they might be in that type of situation people that it would make a lot of sense to actually talk to. They move around the whole building, and they see an awful lot about what's going on. So it's thinking about those type of people, stakeholders who are not necessarily thought about when it comes to consultation and stakeholder participation. He talks about the need to interpret, why things are happening, and actually about making some guesses, generating some hypotheses as to what might be going on, and also some, potential actions. What can we do next? And there's a big element of, thinking about what we might do and trial and error, really experimenting in the sense of what we call shared purpose. So, our shared purpose is to achieve this. We have a discussion about things. We identify some things that we might be reasonable actions to take and to try, and we try those out. We might try them in one area, in a small area to begin with, and pilot those things, and then reflect and build from there. And he talks a lot about getting onto the balcony and off the dance floor. And to me, that's that analogy of thinking a little bit about being in a nightclub. If we stand down there, not that I've done that for many, many years, if we stand on the dance floor, our perspective is limited to perhaps those groups of people who are quite close to us and around us, and maybe a group that we're in conversation with. If we go up, the stairs and stand over on the balcony and look over, we see that, we see the patterns. We see, perhaps if we stand there for quite a while, we see the people who hop around from group to group. So who are the people who are really connected? Who do they, who do they talk to? Where do they go to from one group as they move around to another? What are the different kind of dynamics that are going on? So we see much more by kind of taking that back step and taking a bit of a helicopter view, as we might say. And Ron Heifetz talks about diagnosing, spending a lot of time diagnosing the problem through lots of stakeholder consultation and participation, and getting really wide perspectives. So talking to people that perhaps are not often included in a situation. So it might be, if we're thinking about perhaps current situation of the time of recording with the COVID pandemic, if we're thinking about the university situation, perhaps the group of people that we don't talk to very often would be the cleaners, and they might be in that type of situation people that it would make a lot of sense to actually talk to. They move around the whole building, and they see an awful lot about what's going on. So it's thinking about those type of people, stakeholders who are not necessarily thought about when it comes to consultation and stakeholder participation. He talks about the need to interpret, why things are happening, and actually about making some guesses, generating some hypotheses as to what might be going on, and also some, potential actions. What can we do next? And there's a big element of, thinking about what we might do and trial and error, really experimenting in the sense of what we call shared purpose. So, our shared purpose is to achieve this. We have a discussion about things. We identify some things that we might be reasonable actions to take and to try, and we try those out. We might try them in one area, in a small area to begin with, and pilot those things, and then reflect and build from there. And he talks a lot about getting onto the balcony and off the dance floor. And to me, that's that analogy of thinking a little bit about being in a nightclub. If we stand down there, not that I've done that for many, many years, if we stand on the dance floor, our perspective is limited to perhaps those groups of people who are quite close to us and around us, and maybe a group that we're in conversation with. If we go up, the stairs and stand over on the balcony and look over, we see that, we see the patterns. We see, perhaps if we stand there for quite a while, we see the people who hop around from group to group. So who are the people who are really connected? Who do they, who do they talk to? Where do they go to from one group as they move around to another? What are the different kind of dynamics that are going on? So we see much more by kind of taking that back step and taking a bit of a helicopter view, as we might say. Now, Kurt Lewin's three-step model and his field force analysis underpins many of the more recent process models that we find today, and we can probably see 30 or 40 odd variants of these in the textbooks, and that have been adapted by different consultants and practitioners. Kurt Lewin's idea of this field force analysis was that organisations exist within a social field, and there are always forces for change, so drivers, and forces against change, which tend to be staff fears and so on, costs, disruption and things like that. And he suggested that really what we need to focus on is the forces for change. If they seem to be quite substantial when we map all of this out, then it's a matter of working on those forces that might work against change. So that's where we focus our activity. The scores that he's come up with here are basically weightings that people have given to the different drivers. So somebody saying, customers want new products, we'd weight that as perhaps a 4. Reduced training time is really important, we'd weight that as a 3. So those kind of weightings are given to these different factors. Now that's something that probably managers do think about, those different kind of factors today, and which are more and less important. Quite often, assessing some of these kind of factors, like how fearful staff will be and what the level of disruption will be, can be a best guess. We've not necessarily got perfect information for all of that, so there's an element of subjectivity there around that as well. Thinking about how change occurs, many of the models and basic advice that's there for managers and for leaders, it stems from work by Kurt Lewin, which goes back to the 1940s, and he talked about making change and the need to focus on employees and ensure that they're ready for change. And he developed a 3-step model, which is known as unfreeze, change, or sometimes move, and then refreeze. So unfreezing is about removing the blocks that are likely to create resistance and make it difficult for people to accept and take on board the need for change, and making sure all of that is done before you start to move into actually implementing the changes itself. And then he talked about the fact that in order to make sure that new ways of behaving became permanent, that we took away opportunities for people to slip back into old behaviours and habits, and we actually kind of went through this process, what he called refreeze, so locking in place or making change stick, basically, as we tend to talk about it today, to ensure that those new behaviours and actions become permanent and embedded. Now, this is questionable really today in terms of the different types of change that many organisations go through, and whether it's really possible to actually freeze new behaviours in place. In many cases, organisations are going through more continual change, and this model stems back to a time where change was seen as something that was more rare. We talk about puncturing the equilibrium, so upsetting the kind of balance, and today we would probably say that balance and that stability doesn't really exist, or there's a very short period of time before lots of organisations are making further changes. We see that continual process of adaptation as something that's necessary more often than not today. As I said, there's probably 30, 40 odd different kind of process models which are there really to give managers some guidance and advice. We could see them as recipes really for making change, and in the same way that perhaps when we become familiar with making a particular recipe, we can add substitutes, change things around a bit. Different writers might give you slightly different recipes for making chili con carne, green Thai chicken curry, whatever it is. There'll all be variations on a theme, and this is much the same with these different kind of process models. One of the most familiar to many people is John Kotter's 8 Steps of Change. He originally saw these 8 steps as needing to be followed in a particular order, and if anyone missed out, that change was likely to fail. He now talks more about 8 dimensions or 8 factors, and he sees as a more kind of circular, less linear kind of process than he originally did. The ADKAR model, developed by Prossi consultants, so awareness, desire, knowledge, action and results, is the kind of, it's the mnemonic for that, and this is very much focused on individuals. Are they aware of what they need to do? Do they desire to change? Do they have the knowledge of how to go about doing that, and so on? And Rosbeth Moss-Kanter's 7 Steps, another quite popular one. These can all be found in many of the textbooks written about change. Just to look at John Kotter's 8-step model in a little bit more detail. He first of all talked about creating a sense of urgency, that there's a real need to make this particular change. And he talks about, in his paper, in his book, he talks about knowing CEOs who've manufactured a sense of urgency. So that might be through presenting certain types of information, maybe selectively presenting some information, or just manufacturing. He talks about this sense of urgency. That obviously raises questions, really, that if it's manufactured to that degree, then it's rather coercive, and potentially leaders and managers who use that approach might get caught out, that some of that information is perhaps selective, or it's not quite so urgent as these people might think. Forming a guiding coalition is really talking about the senior leadership team there, and who's going to be the change agents and drive the change through. Creating a vision, so what the future will look like, and he also discusses the fact that can take companies, he's known that take companies really quite a long period of time to actually create a very clear vision, and again today that might not be possible to spend that amount of time working on that actual vision statement. Communicating the vision and the need for change through different mechanisms. And then step 5, empowering others, is about removing some of the blockages, and they're quite often structural kind of factors, policies and processes which might exist but will undermine new ways of working, new behaviours. Quick wins. He suggests this is really about keeping the momentum going for change, so almost building into your change plan some things that can be done relatively easily, and then these can be communicated to people as demonstration that actually progress is being made. And he suggests that if this is quite a long-term change program that's going to go on over perhaps 2 or 3 years, people do really kind of lose momentum, and don't really see a lot happening sometimes. So he talks about building in those kind of milestones and quick wins. Building on the change, institutionalising the change, similar to Kurt Lewin's refreezing. And in fact, the 8-step model is really just an expansion of Kurt Lewin's 3 steps. So building on the things that are working really well, and institutionalising that by rewarding the things that are working well, rewarding the good behaviours. Again, kind of removing things where possible that allow people to slip back into old habits. Now, that is fine if you're talking about something like perhaps a new piece of equipment in a factory. You can remove the old, you can train people on how to use the new, and they may or may not think it's as good as the old piece. You may have some people who are there several years later saying it still doesn't do the things that something else did, but you have removed the possibility for them to be able to use that old equipment. not really quite so easy in more service oriented organizations, where this is very much about, you know, providing a service, customer satisfaction, how people interact with their customer base or service users is really important, and that's much less easy to be able to really, you know, stop people slipping back into old ways of doing things. Now, Burke and Litwin are very well known for their system level model, and this can be applied to a range of different situations, but certainly to the change process. And they're looking at different levels across the organisation and thinking about the organisation in relation to the external environment. So seeing the two as interdependent and affecting one another. So at a high level, we've got things like the mission, the strategy of the organisation, the type of leadership that exists, and the organisational culture. And we can see that all of those things are connected. We can see that the external environment impacts on the mission. For instance, it impacts on the organisational culture and so on. We've then got the next level down, which is where we're thinking about organisational design. So what is the structure? What are the management practices, the systems, the policies and procedures that are in place to effect the mission and the strategy? And from that, we can see that impacts on more local work units. We think about work unit climate. Psychologists distinguish quite more than other perhaps academics between organisational culture and climate, but we might think about that kind of the local, the more local team group unit way of doing things, the kind of feeling, the atmosphere within that work group and unit. And all of that then impacts on, the tasks that individuals perform and the skills that they need. That's part of the way that we design and structure the organisation. The work unit climate will impact on workers' motivation, as will their tasks, their individual skills, and their individual needs. And all of this combines together to impact on both individual and organisational performance, with feedback coming, from these different processes back into the overall organisation and out into the environment as well, and in from the environment. This is all the complicated factors that exist within an organisation, and they're suggesting really that if we make change in one aspect here, then that's going to impact on other different elements of this model. So, if we change particular management practices, it's going to have an impact on how a work unit, a group, a team works, what that kind of climate's like. That's going to affect motivation and so on. Now, a more perhaps we might call a more kind of proprietary or consulting kind of approach has been the McKinsey 7S model, which in many ways is an adaptation of Burke and Litwin's system level model. Now, if we take a more systems type approach to change management, which is what a lot of organisational development specialists will work with, this type of approach, then we're thinking about an organisation as a system. We are seeing it as interdependent, so all these elements affect one another, and that when we make any change, we need to consider all the different kind of subsystems within that organisation. There's a belief that training alone cannot succeed in making change. We can't just kind of train people into new ways of doing things. And this belief that the organisation needs to tap into the energy and the talent of its workforce to kind of steer that energy. But it really needs, there's often language used by OD specialists of kind of harness the energy of the workforce. Removing obstacles and providing that kind of positive reinforcement for change. That comes up within many different models of change management. But also thinking about trying to actually work at the level of social norms or group norms, using those group norms to influence behaviour change. as well as working on the rewards, the different systems and structures that exist. So far we've talked about the fact that there might be plans change, there might be more spontaneous emergent type change. We've got some models, some kind of recipes that can help guide managers and leaders if they're making change, but that also today we're increasingly likely to encounter different types of issues and problems, and that they may well need a different kind of approach. Those traditional process models are not necessarily going to generate the results that we want. And in fact, it's fair to say that there's a lot of writers within the literature talk about the low success rate with change programs. So Beer and Nareer here, despite some individual success, change remains really difficult to pull off. Few companies managing it, and they talk about the fact that many initiatives have this low success rate. And that's supported by a number of writers. So Giardini and colleagues, around 2/3 of major corporate transformations fail. Eisen and colleagues saying, less than 40% succeed, and this figure even may be optimistic. So it doesn't really bode that well. It suggests, if we're talking about major change programs, that either people are not following some of the kind of guidance that's there, or that guidance isn't really working and isn't really helpful. But there is another perspective on this, more critical, what we might call more critical evaluative kind of writers. Mark Hughes is one who spent a very long period of time in his career looking into change management, and he questions quite a lot of this research that suggests such low success rates with change. He says, actually, I've been really in depth through all the existing literature, and although a number of writers state this, I can't really find their evidence. They don't tend to provide that much evidence that backs this up. And he talks about John Cotter's book about change management actually has really no other references in it. Now, that's fine. In many ways, it might be written for practitioners, and it's written from his many years of experience of working with large corporations. But it does raise those kind of questions as to, where do these kind of stats actually come from? And how are people judging what is success in a change program? Is it when all the objectives right at the start are not seen to come through in the end? But might it be right that organisations have adapted as they've gone along? That's one thing to consider. Now, there are a number of blocks to successful change, it's fair to say, identified within the literature. This next couple of slides is adapted from a book by Colin Carnell and Rune Toddenham-Bai, and they talk about perceptual blocks, so people's difficulty in really identifying the real problem. Falling into kind of stereotype, seeing what they expect to see, not really getting enough different perspectives on a problem, sometimes almost having too much information, the opposite, and not using all our senses to gather data, so not looking, not listening and hearing as we might do. The emotional blocks, lots of attention to, employees' kind of fears, but also managers' fears of risk and failure as well. Inability perhaps sometimes of people to sleep on the problem, countered by some who tend to procrastinate and think about it too much. So a range of emotional blocks. Other blocks can be cultural, so discussing certain issues in certain cultures can be taboo, and this cultural idea of more contemporary ideas of dealing with change, and this idea of kind of trying things out and being prepared to fail is something that in lots of cultures is trained out of us. This kind of playing with something and giving it a go isn't something that we've always been encouraged to do in all organisations. We tend to expect that leaders have answers, that there's a right way to do things and a wrong way, and we should be getting things right more from the start. So often we've created that kind of expectation, and those kind of traditions can be quite hard to overcome. Environmental or contextual issues, so that, support for change ideas. People, can have good ideas and bad ideas at all levels in organisations. But where a hierarchy exists, which it does in, some kind of hierarchy exists in most big organisations, then you really need the support of those senior people to help things along the way, even if they're not heavily involved in actually implementing change. Quite often there are times when those senior leadership and that support for something is really needed. It gives legitimacy to the change, if nothing else. And so that lack of support and engagement from senior people can be problematic. People being unable to accept criticism, poor kind of cultures, low trust in a culture. If we've got bosses who think they've got all the answers, or inflexible strategies, they can be blocks to change as well. Now, when it comes to thinking about the people and thinking about engaging people to change behaviours, or to just accept, new structures, whatever it might be. There's theory that comes from diffusion of ideas within organisations, and from sort of things like marketing with adoption of products, that suggests that people fall into different kinds of groups, and that really we need to focus to begin with, certainly, on the people who we're going to actually have a reasonable chance of success with. So if we put a huge amount of effort in trying to convince everybody, then some of that effort basically may be wasted. So we've got people who are at the top end, the visionaries, the enthusiasts, who are much more likely to get on board, as we might say, with a change idea than others, followed by people who are then in the kind of mainstream and will adopt, and then the group who are the real resistors, and they may be resisting several years later. So we've got people who are innovators, who drive change, come up with ideas, might be quite well respected. Sometimes the dream realisers, or in Belbin terms, maybe the plants, with lots of different ideas. Then we've got the early adopters who embrace new ideas quite quickly, got a strong sense of self-efficacy, or belief that it will work and that they can do it. So they like to be at the forefront of trying out ideas. And then we've got the more kind of pragmatic people who, once they start to see some of those people, doing things and it works, that product works, that equipment works, seems to be a great idea, they start to get it on board and start to help this idea, this change, start to be embedded, really, to give it a bit more mass appeal, as it says on the chart here. So it's thinking perhaps about where some of our people in our organisation sit in relation to this. Our egg psychologist suggests that resistance to change is actually a personality trait, a fairly stable personality trait, and developed a resistance to change scale to measure that, and found that there was a positive and significant relationship between the score that individuals got on is change index, and their actual behaviour and their affective state, so their feelings, their kind of emotions that they displayed. So, how they felt towards things, and whether they actually resisted the change or not. But suggested that, that's a part and parcel of the issue, but, the issues within the context are going to play a role. So the level of trust that exists, for instance, in a management team, it is going to have some impact on that. Interestingly, he found that increased information that was given to people actually resulted in worse evaluations of change and more willingness to resist. And every change model we come across talks about communication and the need for information, and that raises questions really as to, well, how much is too much. Often we talk about the timing of change, perhaps, giving quite short, quite clear kind of indications to begin with of any major change, and then remembering that we've got to really keep repeating that, and tailoring that information to individuals. But how much is too much? And getting that timing right is another tricky issue to be tackled. Now, an individual's propensity for change, depends on a variety of factors. And these 5 factors outlined here, perhaps summarise those. One is in relation to the nature of change itself. So, depending on, what type of change is happening within the organisation, what people are being asked to do. So the nature of that change is going to impact how they respond to it. The consequences of that change. People always think, what does this mean to me? Yes, they might say, okay, I can understand why this is happening at an organisational level, but what does this really impact? What does this mean for me? How's it going to impact on my own personal life is where people are primarily concerned. What's the organisational history? If there's been a lot of recent change, if it's been handled well or if it's been handled badly, that's likely to have an impact. So where we have a legacy of poorly managed change, then we might expect people to be less up for change, be more resistant to it. The type of individual itself, how open to change are they? How, anxious does change make them feel? All those more kind of attitudinal, personality type factors. And then the individual's own history. So even if the organisation's not had perhaps a legacy of poor change or not been through a lot of organisational change in recent times or during this individual's lifetime with the organisation, they might have come from previous organisations where they've experienced, bad change, good change, whatever. That history, their own history, is also likely to impact on how they respond. And as well as people falling into those different types of categories, of course, people are often affected by organisational change directly, and individuals have different ways of coping. Some cope with much more dramatic changes than others do. There are lots of different individual coping cycle sort of diagrams or variations of this cycle. Again, this comes from Carnell and Toddenham-By, and this work originally stems from work by Kubler-Ross within nursing, in relation to how patients would deal with bad news, that they've got a serious illness, a terminal illness, something like that. And this kind of coping in relation to change is often seen as being a bit like a bereavement type cycle that people go through. Here it's been mapped against those 3 phases, 3 stages of Kurt Lewin's change model. So they talk about, and it's been mapped in terms of the effect on performance, individual performance, and self-esteem as well. So the first is about denying that the change is really going to happen. Sometimes people have been through changes before and say, oh, I've heard this before and it never really gets off the ground, so yeah, it'll all get forgotten about, it's not going to happen really. Then maybe start to recognise that, okay, well, this is going on for a little bit longer, maybe it will actually happen, getting a little bit defensive about it, or I don't think it, I don't see why I should be affected by this. I'm doing everything that's asking, and I'm doing things and it's all working out okay, so I don't really see why I should change. And then as a bit more time goes on, starting to realise that actually reality kicks in. I do need to discard or stop doing these things. And it's at that point often that performance really drops and the person's self-esteem really drops as well. And it's how we get them out of that kind of dip, and to start adapting, and really internalising and working with these new ways of doing things. And that's where a lot of support and focus really needs to go in. And this type of coping cycle is linked very closely really with William Bridges' transition cycle. And Bridges suggests it's not really the change that does you in, as he says, it's the actual kind of transition process. that individuals will be going through their own mental transition process. So they need time to sort of let go of things. There needs to be a kind of ending, and people will be going through that kind of denial at that stage. Probably quite shocked. They might be angry about certain types of changes. And then eventually they come down into a more neutral zone, and we need to try and kind of get them out of that more neutral zone and start to be more positive about things, get more hopeful about things. But he talks about the whole gambit of emotions really that people can go through. And researchers have suggested that these type of transitions, or the individual coping cycle, it's very individual. It depends also on the type of change, people's history of change. If they've been in an organisation a long time, and then if they've gone through change previously and there's a legacy perhaps of poorly managed change, all those different things will impact on how they react to it. But the individuals can go through a change cycle in relation to reasonably major change within either a few hours, or it takes them about 7 years to get there. So quite a range there. We've talked quite a bit about resistance, as I say, just now, and much of the literature talks about resistance. I think we should probably also say that staff, employees don't always resist change. There's a tendency to indicate that everybody does. Sometimes people are crying out for change. They see that things need to change, and they really want it. They might not always be happy with what's done to address that need, but not everybody resists all the time. And Edgar Schein's work also suggests that we need to try and use any fears that individuals have in a more productive way. And he suggests that actually, change is about learning new ways of doing things. And, a lot of learning is a little bit coercive. And he says that's especially the case in corporate change. We need to kind of create conditions really to kind of give people the impetus to actually kind of learn those new behaviours. And he suggests that there are two forces at work when people do need to learn new ways of doing things. There's a survival anxiety. So, am I going to lose my job, and what's going to happen if I don't make these changes? But there's also often a learning anxiety. So, will I be able to do this? I'm skilled at what I do now. I'm quite comfortable. What if I fail? Am I going to be exposed? I'm going to be seen as incompetent. And he actually suggests we actually need that survival anxiety to be a bit higher than the learning anxiety. So people need to kind of be a little bit more focused on, what if I don't change? And I've really kind of got to do this and got to overcome these fears, to make headway, basically. Now, one of the tasks of leaders is said to be framing change for people in language that makes sense to them. So helping people alter their perspective, change the way that they see things. And Carl Weick's work on sense making is key to this. And he was suggesting that sense making, literally how people do make sense, create meaning of situations, is that it's something that is part and parcel of their identity construction, their sense of who they are. And we have different identities in relation to kind of the workplace, our social life, an overall sense of identity, and so on. That it's a retrospective process, so we look back on things and we make sense of them. We do so in discussing these things with other people, so it's a social and an ongoing activity. And that White suggested people are actually participating in their situation, in their environment, at the same time as they're making sense of it. So again, it's this social activity, we're working our way through problems, through changes, and we're making sense of these as that change is happening. And that people do that based on cues that they get from the environment. So what are those kind of cues that leaders are giving out? What about more informal leaders, people who are perhaps seen as experts, looked to as role models by many people within an organisation? How are they responding? Do they seem quite positive about this change? Are they making sense of it in a particular kind of way? And very importantly, this is much more about what seems to be plausible to individuals, so what makes sense to them, rather than what is absolutely accurate. So a lot of people talk about how now leaders need to work with this process of sense making. So recognise that this is going on, be part and parcel of that social ongoing discussion, be giving the right kind of cues to people within their organisation. Now, when we looked at Burke and Litwin's model, I talked about system level change and thinking about the organisation as a whole. But many organisations organise work, as we know, around groups and teams, and individuals themselves are influenced by the teams, the groups that they are members of, whether that just be a social group within the organisation. And Jenny Cross talks about behaviour change in a particular TED talk. Is a very, very well viewed TED talk. So again, you can do a search for 3 Myths of Behaviour Change TED talk and have a look at this. And she says that, there are, say, a number of myths really about what making behaviour change is all about. Summarising these as one, that education or information is enough. No, she says it's not. It's much more about, how we put that information across, quite how we position that information. Another key belief, which she says is a myth, is that we need to change people's attitudes before their behaviour will change. She says, no, we don't need to do that. And her view links very much with the view of others around leadership. So Herminia Ribara, for instance, talks about act like a leader, think like a leader, that when we're involved in leadership development, then, people don't automatically think of themselves as a leader to begin with. They don't have that attitude. What we need to do is put them in a position where they start to have to take on the role of a leader, start to have to act like a leader. And as they get used to that, then their attitudes change afterwards. And Jenny Cross is along similar kind of line of thinking. And finally, she says, yes, it's quite astonishing, but, people don't know what motivates their behaviour. So if we carry out attitudinal surveys, for instance, asking people how they might behave in a particular situation, it doesn't really correlate with what they actually do in practice. Another approach that sort of fits alongside some of this is what's known as a more positive kind of psychological approach. There's a lot of talk about positive psychology and working with what's working well today. An appreciative inquiry is one of those approaches. David Cooper-Ryde as work key there. And to some extent, it has a rather organisational development, a little bit jingoistic kind of terminology associated with it. But he talks about defining topic areas to work on. So as part of group discussion, actually working out what is the thing that we're actually going to be kind of focusing on to perhaps try and improve a situation. And then a process that he calls of discovery. And that's about, rather than asking what can we do better, it's around saying what do we do that works really well? Where are we getting good results in this organisation with these types of service users, customers, whatever. So what's already working? And by focusing on the positives, it's suggested it's almost implicitly you work out some of the things that are not working so well. And you build on, you think about extending and adapting the positive actions, the actions that are already working. And that's related to this kind of sense of dream, thinking about this kind of overall vision and what you might want to happen. And then designing interventions in a more positive way, focusing on those kind of things that are working really well and how they might be adapted and expanded out to improve things overall. So to conclude, there are different types of problem or different type of issues that underlie most change management programs, and they require different approaches from everyone involved, but particularly from leaders and managers. It has to be said that making even quite small scale change within an organisation is rarely easy. It impacts on people usually to at least some extent, and those people have got to make the psychological transition. Now, change programs are argued to have a poor rate of success, but we know that others, such as Mark Hughes, who've really delved into the literature on this, question this. They say that a lot of academics state this, but they don't really give their evidence behind it. Leaders, including senior managers, middle managers, HR professionals, all have a role in ensuring successful implementation of change management programs. In some instances, using external change agents, consultants can be helpful. It's costly, resource heavy, but it can be helpful to have that external perspective. There are multiple models from academics adapted by practitioners that exist as recipes really for change management. Some of those are much more prescriptive than others, and we can certainly use them as a guide if we've got plans change going on, and just really to kind of think about the different dimensions or different elements that we need to consider. And then if we're taking a more critical academic perspective, those types of scholars highlight issues such as, how inclusive are the change management programs, how complex are these, who loses out, who wins within change management situations, and those types of perspectives. Thank you for listening.